In the last lecture, we looked at the position of labour in human history and the specificity of humans, of the human species as a producing species, and we looked at how that was expressed in through the concept of the forces, the development of the forces of production and the relations of production, the deep processes that move human history and create social change. We looked at the dialectic of the forces and relations of production that Marx and Engels argued have driven human history and created a series of qualitatively different modes of production throughout human history. And we saw how the modes of production, the concept of the mode of production, is Marx and Engels' way of understanding more complex societies. So, you know, a given society contains within it a particular dominant mode of production that gives you the key to understanding what's happening, how that society is structured, and what the most important relationships are within that society. Each mode of production represents for Marx and Engels a qualitative stage in the development of human history, of that dialectic of forces and relations of production. And it will contain within it contradictions that are driving further social change. Contradictions which, when they reach a certain critical point, will bring into existence great epochs of social revolution. I use that phrase quite a lot that Marx uses in the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, which is his most concise statement of historical materialism. He talks about epochs of social revolution. And what I want to do in this lecture is to focus in a little bit more on the role of class struggle within those epochs of social revolution. Each class struggle, I will argue, is the form through which the antagonisms and contradictions that form the deep processes of social change in society. It's these class struggles that through which those antagonisms are expressed and take the form of conscious human action. Beneath and it's class struggles also that I think that connect those processes that Marx and Engels describe at quite a high level of abstraction, the dialectic of forces and relations of production. But it's class struggles that connect that dialectic to the things that we think of as being human history, the historical record of events, the personalities and processes that we think of as being history. Beneath those lie the actions of Marx and Engels argue, lie the actions of great masses of people thrown into classes. And it's when classes move that history moves. So, the Marxist understanding of classes is quite distinct and distinctive and different from the kind of sociological ones that we find in everyday political discussion. And Marx and Engels never really define it in a kind of, this is what we mean by class, although it's implicit all the way through their writing. But there's quite a neat definition that Lenin gave in 1918 in a little pamphlet called A Great Beginning, where he's talking to a group of Soviet workers about what classes are, and he describes them as being large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production, by their relation, in most cases fixed and formulated in law, to the means of production, and by their role in the social organisation of labour. And that's a really neat formulation, actually, and it places the emphasis firmly, as in all of Marx and Engels' writing, on their position in relation to the means of production. That is what defines you being in a class. Not your access to certain market goods, not your access to kind of a particular kind of set of cultural markers of a lifestyle, not your wealth levels. It's your position in relation to production that defines you as being part of one of the fundamentally important classes of society. Classes are defined by production relations. Every mode of production throughout human history contains key classes that arise from its dominant relations of production and property. So, social formations, however, and when the difference between a mode of production and a social formation is, a mode of production describes the things that are common to all, give a set of social formations, the common set of production relations, and then a social formation is, I mean, it's really, Lenin develops that concept more, but it's in Marx and Engels as well. A social formation is a way of describing a particular society. So when you're talking about Britain or Russia or France, you're talking about a particular social formation in time. A mode of production operates at a higher level of abstraction. Social formations are more complex, but the classes of the dominant mode are critical in structuring society and driving social change. So, for example, the feudal mode of production for Marx and Engels, the feudal mode of production that dominated medieval Europe, contains two great classes established by its relations of production: the feudal aristocracy and a class of peasant farmers who paid feudal dues to the landowners in the form of labour services or rents or money, or rents in money or kind. That's the basic class structure of the feudal mode of production. But a medieval social formation will contain more complex class structure than that. And once you look down at an actual medieval society, it will contain more classes than that, more groups than that, more social groups than that. But without understanding the class structure, you can't understand the fundamental nature of that society. And similarly, Marx and Engels argued the capitalist mode of production establishes two great new classes as decisive: the bourgeoisie, who control capital and access to the means of production, and the working class, which has no access to means of production except by selling its labour. And similarly, capitalist social formations contain other classes, such as the remains of aristocracies and peasantries carried over from the feudal mode, petty bourgeoisies, and then not to mention the heavy stratification of the basic classes. So a working class in a capitalist social formation won't all look the same. It will be heavily stratified according to the nature of that society. But the key point is that if you want to understand what structures and what moves a society, Marx and Engels argue you need to look at what's happening with the basic classes that arise from its mode of production. So class struggles, classes arising from the means of production, from the relations of production, structure society, but they also enact and express the transformation of society. They don't just structure it, they transform it. All class societies contain class struggles that go on every day over the control of the surplus labour. And these arise from the dominant mode of production, the struggle over surplus. So in a feudal society, the struggle to extract rent or to control the amount of rent being extracted from you, or in capitalist societies, the struggle to extract surplus value, or the struggle to hold the value of wages up. And at the same time, class struggles that emerge not just from that basic class structure of the mode of production, but from the emergence of new forces and relations within the established mode. Class struggles are the way in which the forces driving those epochs of social revolution are expressed in the actions of social agents in history. They carry these forces up into more or less conscious historical action. So, for example, within medieval England, to go back to that example again, the dominant feudal mode of production meant that there was a constant class struggle between the exploiting landlords and the exploited peasantry. But within that mode is also growing up groups whose economic relations are increasingly capitalistic in character, and who increasingly feel the political dominance of the feudal nobility as a limit on their aspirations. Merchants, urban handicraftsmen, even richer peasants who were able to benefit from their own class struggle to amass a surplus and start to employ landless rural workers themselves. This is how the forces driving and creating epochs of social revolution become expressed in the actions of humans organised into classes. And faced with those limits, people born into these emerging economic relationships start to struggle. More or less self-consciously, they start to cohere, and then they start to form a class, struggling to assert their own interests, ultimately by reshaping the social order around them. Through these class struggles, the dominant relations of production will be challenged, and then at a certain point of development, they will be transformed. Now, these periods of class struggle can last centuries, and they can go through a series of phases. And the fate of those phases of struggle will themselves be determined by the level of development of the antagonism between forces and relations of production. So there is a constant dialectic going on in the first lecture we talked about, at a high level of abstraction, Marx and Engels talking about men make their own humans make their own history, but not just as they please, always in conditions that they've inherited and circumstances that they've inherited. And this is another way in which you see that dialectic playing out. There is a constant dialectic between the conditions of possibility and people's agency, their ability to make their own history in circumstances that they inherit, and their capacity to play their historical role self-consciously. And their ability to play that role self-consciously depends on understanding those conditions. Now, Marx and Engels give their primary example historical example for demonstrating this process in action was what they called the bourgeois revolution. The historical process whereby the bourgeoisie came into being as a class, and then at a certain point in time took actions that revolutionized the mode of production, moving historical societies in Europe and decisively installing bourgeois capitalist economic relations at a certain point in time. So in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels talk about the bourgeoisie being a product of revolutions in the mode of production and exchange. The bourgeoisie is being brought into existence by things happening within the production relations of the feudal mode. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels give a really neat historical summary of the way in which the bourgeoisie begins to experience its own interests as defined against the feudal nobility through its new relations of production, through trade and commerce, and the limits on their ability to trade and commerce effectively posed by the feudal nobility. And in the process of experiencing those limits, they begin to coalesce as a class in opposition to the feudal landowners. And as they do so, they begin to focus on political power and develop their own, and the struggle for political power. And in sections of, and in the Communist Manifesto, but also really powerfully in the last historical sections of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx demonstrates how over time the bourgeoisie becomes more conscious of the need to take control of the state. And at the point where it takes control of challenges the feudal nobility for control of the state, then it's able to impose its relations of production completely upon society, and that leads to a qualitative transformation of society into being one characterized by capitalist economic relations, and it sets free the laws of the capitalist mode of production. Now, this is not a struggle that the bourgeoisie wages with full intentionality throughout history. It's a struggle that Marx talks about taking place over something like 400 years. And in those 400 years, the bourgeoisie, the early phases of the bourgeois revolution involved small groups of merchants in city-states or traders in pockets of Europe experiencing feudal domination as being a limit on their aspirations, and gradually connecting those struggles up and gradually becoming more self-conscious over time, to the point where in the 18th and 19th centuries they self-consciously struggle against the feudal nobility for control of the state. But each section of the bourgeoisie didn't necessarily intend the result at every point of the struggle. Now, once the capitalist mode of production has been established and its laws are set in motion, so those laws of motion begin to constitute the working class as a potential revolutionary subject within capitalism. And this is Marx and Engels demonstrating the same, not the same historical process, but the historical process whereby capitalism begins and capitalist economic relations begin to create the working class and begin that process of throwing people together into a working class over time, to the point where they have to become self-conscious about it. The accumulation process creates vast combinations of social labour. People who are engaged in a more sophisticated form of production as wage labourers, while at the same time the accumulation process diminishes the number of capitalists, making the possibility of class struggle more, making it easier to see the class relationships of society. The laws of capitalist competition and accumulation force workers to combine and associate to defend their wages. And then the reaction of the capitalist class to that phenomenon, through its control of the state forces, control of the state, compels the working class to confront class and state power. So in just the same way as the bourgeoisie is thrown together by historical forces over time and compelled to become self-conscious, in just the same way, the capitalism does that to the working class. It creates the working class over a period of history. And it creates the historical conditions for the working class to become self-conscious. But in order to become a truly revolutionary class, the working class can't just resist, but it has to recognise, we talked about this quite a lot in the first class, it has to recognise the growth of new forces and relations inside the womb of capitalist society and unleash them. It's not just a resistance to capitalism, but an unlocking of the potentials within capitalism that are being developed. And I think you can see in this process, if you think about that, sort of the three stages that I've marked up on there, you can see in that almost the entire history of labour movements in Europe and in Britain and Europe. In the 18th and 19th centuries, you see the first stages of association and defensive combinations as people form small, localised trade unions around crafts in defence of their wages. And then over the 19th century, those become embedded into permanent trade unions. You get the formation of permanent trade unions. And then also of permanent political parties aimed at challenging state power, either in a sense of reforming state power or eventually of challenging it on a revolutionary basis at the end of the century and into the 20th century. You get the creation of political parties purporting to represent the entire working class and drawing on the trade unions for strength, although those parties are divided over their strategies for achieving power. I want to move on to talk a little bit about ideology. Because just as class struggles, as I've suggested, class struggles are the expression in human action of antagonisms that arise within the basis, the mode of production, so class struggles are also expressed themselves in the form of a battle of ideas. And I'm back to the quote we looked at last week from the preface. It's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. Marx and Engels argue that the ideas current and circulating within society are themselves expressions of things of class imperatives and class formations within society, and they express those social relationships. There's a really great quote from Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is one of the most fantastic bits of his writing that exists. It's just a superb piece of prose writing, but it's also a demonstration of historical materialism at the level of political events, interpreting political events. So in the 18th Brumaire, Marx talks about how the coup d'etat of Louis Bonaparte and how he became essentially the dictator of France on the back of the 1848 revolution. How do we understand that as a battle of class forces? How do we understand what happened, and how do we relate that to class struggle? And it's a brilliant exercise in historical materialism from that point of view. But within it also there are some really brilliant formulations about how ideas and ideology arise from different forms of property and express the interests of different forms of property. And I've given you a quote there from the 18th Brumaire. Upon the different forms of property, upon the social conditions of existence, rises an entire superstructure of distinct and peculiarly formed sentiments, illusions, modes of thought and views of life. The entire class creates and forms them out of its material foundations and out of the corresponding social relations. The single individual who derives them through tradition and upbringing may imagine that they form the real motives and the starting point of his activity. Marx argues that the things that part of being self-conscious, a self-conscious historical actor, is to understand that the ideas that you inherit as deriving from your material class position and your class interest, which is quite the reverse of what how people are socialized into thinking in capitalist societies. And then Marx, and in the Manifesto of the Communist Party and elsewhere, and in the German ideology, Marx and Engels talk about the ruling ideas. Within each, just as there's a ruling class in a dominant position within every mode of production, within every social formation, so the ruling ideas of each age are in fact those of the ruling class. And we can, I think, you can see this. Yeah. I was going to talk a little bit about neoliberalism from this point of view. Within the dominant ideas within any society present themselves as being universal ideas that exist in the interests of everyone in society. And it's quite. I was sort of thinking about neoliberalism on this basis. I think there's a tendency. On the one hand, there are people within society who think that neoliberalism is just the way that the world works. And then there are other people in society who think that neoliberalism is a real problem, but they see it as a sort of disembodied thing all around them, a set of ideas that need to be challenged. And I think if you're thinking about it from Marx and Engels' point of view, or from a Marxist point of view, neoliberalism has to be located. You have to look at what's the class basis of neoliberalism? Where does it come from? And I think you could argue that it's, broadly speaking, it's a complex of ideas about the efficiency and omnipotence of freely operating markets as the most effective way of distributing resources and justice. And you can find ideas about the historically new level of globalization of the world economy, the interpenetration of markets, cultures, the positive values of the free movement of capital, goods and people. That's all sort of bundle of ideas that constitutes the neoliberalism. And if you look at historically where it emerges from and what's happening within capitalist societies at that time, that ensemble of ideas arises on the basis of it reflects the values of a fraction of the capitalist class, not even the whole capitalist class, actually, but a fraction of the capitalist class whose business orientations were transnational in scope and scale, who they were entangled with the growth of financial products around the globe and within national economies, and for whom things like the freedom of capital, of goods and highly skilled labour are of great importance. And that fraction, it's when that fraction of the capitalist class becomes dominant within powerful national economies and national states, and around institutions like Wall Street and the City of London, for example, and then they begin to influence transnational organisations of capitalist reproduction like the IMF and the World Bank, then neoliberalism becomes like the dominant ideology within the capitalist world. And as it did so, it tried to represent its interests as being universal, and that all opposition to it was irrational. Efficient markets benefited everyone, attempts to insist otherwise were just conservative and based on tradition, or sprang from irrational prejudice. And there's a really neat example of this. I was looking back over Tony Blair's speeches. Blair's speeches from 2005, and then very recently he gave one on the need to defend globalization against the new nationalism. And they're very similar speeches in a way, but Blair's speeches, it's not a fun experience reading them. But it is worth doing to see, because he uses ideology. He's a very good example of how neoliberalism presents its ideology as being universal. In that 2005 speech to the Labour Party conference, he said, I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. And he said, there's no mystery about what works in the global economy. It's an open, liberal economy prepared constantly to change and remain competitive. And if you stand in the way of that, you're clinging onto the past, a past that will no longer work. Or he describes the Conservatives as being lost in the fog of ancient memories. And he was describing the Labour left at that time as being lost in the fog of ancient memories. This is an unstoppable force, and anyone who stands in its way is simply a victim of prejudice, delusion, or lost in nostalgia for a passing world. It's a very good example of self-consciously using ideology in that way. So working class struggles must involve a struggle to overthrow and subordinate ruling ideas as well as structures and institutions in an epoch. And I think you can see and Marxists putting this into action in revolutionary processes in the 20th century. I was looking back at last year during the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution. I was looking back at some of the actions of the Bolsheviks not that long after they had taken power. I mean, they were fighting a civil war to survive, and they had to concentrate on fighting the civil war to survive. But by 1920-21, they were already thinking about the importance of the battle of ideas, of waging a self-conscious class struggle at the level of ideas. And they were talking about cultural revolution and educational, the importance of educational work, and of a whole raft of ideological work that would challenge the ideological reflection of class interest, of that ruling, the ideological dominance of that ruling ideology inherited from the past. And I think, you can also, I think that one of the really encouraging things about the current left leadership in the Labour Party is the recognition of the importance of a battle of ideas. And I think that you can see it in the investment that's gone into things like the World Transformed. I mean, there's a debate to be had about the content of those ideas, definitely, and how transformative they are. But the fact is that a left Labour leadership is investing in political education as a priority, and that's a hugely important thing. And I want to finish just by talking about the way in which, we've been talking about the way in which class struggles are reflected in battles of ideas and things, but I wanted to talk about the way in which Marx and Engels describe class struggles, where class struggle takes place, and how they relate that to the kind of everyday political events that take place in society. And they develop for their analysis the concept of a distinction between a basis and the superstructure. If you're looking, and this isn't something, you don't look at the mode of production and its basis and superstructure. This is a set of conceptual tools for looking at social formations, at particular societies. If you want to understand, if you want to analyse a society and understand what's happening in it, understand and be able to pick out the way in which the forces and relations of production are changing that society, and the way in which that's being reflected in class struggles, and the way in which that's connected to political events. It's helpful to disaggregate, to unpick society into being a basis and a superstructure which interact and transform each other over time. And what they mean by the basis is essentially the mode of production and the economic relations, the dominant economic relations within that society. And the superstructure, Marx talks about the superstructure being the legal, political, cultural and ideological relations within that social formation. And in the preface, again, we always go back to the preface, he talks about the way in which the changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. So you always have to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, and the legal, political, religious, artistic or philosophical forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. So it's the ways in which class ideas and class struggles have become sedimented into political institutions and social institutions and cultures, and then become the zones of class struggle, as I've called it there. And I wanted just to take an example, I suppose, just to take an example of how we might think about the basis and superstructure in relation to contemporary Britain, for example. If we were thinking about Britain as an advanced capitalist country in the 21st century, we could see that it has a relatively high technology and skills, although that's collapsed against competitor economies, definitely. Most of its production's in high-skilled finance and services and low-skilled manufacturing and services. Its relations of production are capitalist, although there are some residual forms of social ownership that's still left. The capitalist class is divided in Britain between a dominant group, which is a relatively small group of transnationally oriented monopolistic firms, with a heavy bias towards the financial sector, And these are largely owned by US or German transnational finance capitalists. And then you've got a long tail of smaller capitalist firms, many employing relatively small numbers of people, focused on services of varying kinds. And then you've got a working class who are equally stratified, incorporating what tends to be thought of as being the middle class, but are in fact, in Marxian terms, most definitely a higher strata of the working class, concentrated around London and the big cities, and then a town-based working class for whom economic precariousness is a daily reality. I'm caricaturing, obviously, to an extent. And then, on that basis, we would look at the superstructure, which would include a state apparatus which is dominated by big financial and transnational corporations, and which is used to pursue overseas resource wars and geopolitical influence, a legal system that enshrines private property rights and restricts collective trade union organisation, a democratic political system which is nominally liberal and democratic, but which strictly delimits actual democratic control and participation, and in which big business seeks to manipulate and dominate all the main political parties, an increasingly corporate media and a state-owned media platform which reproduces the views of the dominant class, a culture which promotes consumer choice and individual autonomy as the predominant forms of cultural agency, and so on. So you can see these are the superstructural elements which have arisen from the capitalist economic and social relations of the basis. Yet, within that spontaneously arising capitalist character of the superstructure, there is always a political and cultural struggle which is arising from the basis. And you can see this in the way as the neoliberal promise of prosperity and an end to boom and bust economics fell apart with the global financial crisis, and the sheer inability of Britain's productive forces, as currently organised, to provide any prospect of a decent standard of living for the majority of the citizens is becoming more apparent. So working class people have responded in a number of different ways that are being expressed in the superstructure. On the one hand, you have sharp fluctuations in political participation, rising support for racist and fascist organisations, aggravated social and cultural conflict, and inter-ethnic and religious tensions, terrorism, on the other hand, a revival of mass participation in the Labour Party on a left social democratic agenda, and a corresponding attempt to rebuild far-right politics, both within and outside the Conservative Party. So what appear to be these kind of struggles about ideologies and ideas, and are often described in political discussion as being struggles over ideas, over progress against reaction, prejudice against universal values of human rights. All of them are in fact traceable to class struggles and developments within the basis as they're expressed and fought out in the superstructure of society. And in the last lecture, I'm going to finish there. In the last lecture, I want to focus in on how this, if we think that this is a compelling account of reality, how does this change our political action? How does this affect the way that we think about history and the way that we think about our agency and our political action in the world?